Hello. It was in 1925 that William Jennings Bryan stood before a packed courthouse in a small town in Tennessee called Dayton, Tennessee, where he declared that his presence there was to engage in a duel between the forces of Christianity and the forces of evolution. It was a duel, he said, to the death, prophetically, as we will see in a moment. It was a duel in which he had come to protect America's children from being robbed of their chance at eternal life. Because the doctrine taught or advanced by the forces of evolution went contrary to the teachings of the Bible. And therefore he stood along with many who felt that evolution represented a point at which society had come to, one of unhealthy change and unhealthy progress. The trial, as we began to talk about last time, occurred over the passage of Tennessee's anti-evolution law and the half-jokingly, serial-comical flaunting of the law by John T. Scopes. The Scopes trial, and while it was in a sense an act of a young 24-year-old teacher who was goaded into it by his friends, symbolized and epitomized these two contradictory tendencies of the 1920s. This decade of paradox. In many ways, the Scopes trial was the epitome of this contradiction of the 1920s, which will go on, as we will see, into the economic arena in 1928 and 1929. This little sleepy town was the scene of a battle that was extremely serious to many people. Today, some scholars make light of it and argue that really, in spite of all the dramatics and all the histrionics that took place, that the trial was simply a struggle for simple academic freedom versus some Tennessee Hottentots. But it was more than that, as we will see in a moment, as I will argue. But as the trial commenced, I'll set the scene for you. Most people had never heard of Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. And I should point out that Texas, in the same year, the Texas State School Board, had passed its own resolution prohibiting the teaching of evolution in the state of Texas as well in 1925. However, it had the force of a school board act, and therefore it did not have the same force of law that the case in Dayton, Tennessee had. But you had two of America's giants in their own fields. Clarence Darrow, who had been enticed into taking the case by Arthur Garfield Hayes, who was a member of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, who defended John T. Scopes. And then you had William Jennings Bryan. Darrow is the preeminent trial lawyer in America at this time. He had just become involved in the famous Sweet case in Detroit, defending a black man against mob violence. Darrow was, and eventually was able to exonerate Dr. Sweet for shooting someone in defense of his home. Darrow was really a superb litigator. On the other hand, he was not a lawyer, but he was clearly a man who had earned a reputation as an individual with great passion and a great, as I once said, silver tongue, the silver-tongued orator William Jennings Bryan. The perennial Democratic Party presidential candidate until Woodrow Wilson emancipated the party from Bryan. Bryan was a deeply and devoutly religious man. Bryan had been prevailed upon to accept this challenge, to support the state against Scopes by the World Christian Fundamental Association. By the World Christian Fundamental Association. When he arrived in Dayton, Tennessee, someone remarked that Bryan gave the impression of one who had just returned to earth from the wars of religion and was now ready to engage in another. Well, this sleepy town was no longer unknown in 1925. The trial itself was actually broadcast on the radio. You couldn't find another place for a news or wire service. Tables, tents had been set up to house a throng of reporters from everywhere in the world, as far away as Japan and Sweden. This case had now not only become a case about Tennessee, it had become a case about the world. And it was a world that many in the 1920s felt was changing too fast. And that is why, to a great extent, I think Bryan and others who were fundamentalists fought so hard to slow change down any way that they could. Change was frightening to them. There was also a kind of resentment against the arrogance of science. That in the 1920s, science now occupied a preeminent place in American society. And there was a kind of arrogance about science in the 1920s. Experiments with radioactivity, progress with electricity, the discovery of vitamins, and we could go on and on. Freud's theories. Clearly, science was in its heyday in the 1920s. As one behavioral scientist by the name of Watson mockingly, as he was criticizing the evolutionists and those who were anti-science, he said, look, no one has ever touched a soul and seen it. Or has one ever seen a soul in a test tube? This kind of arrogance. One has never seen a soul in a test tube. Or that one has not physically touched the soul. So therefore, religion obviously was something to be scoffed at. Science, on the other hand, science could always document its results. If you were a freshman in biology, what was the first thing that you were taught about your science class? That science, unlike all the other disciplines, subscribed to the scientific method, that it could be proved with tangible results. Was that not true? Unlike the other disciplines. Hard science. And with it came a kind of arrogance, of almost the notion that it was infallible. To some extent, you had the arrogance of both science and the arrogance of the fundamentalists, who were just as what? Uncompromising on their own positions about the world and the universe. So you had two, I wouldn't call religion a discipline, but I will for the sake of this discussion. You had two disciplines which were both arrogant in their assertions. There were those who even believed that science could provide for the world every possible balm and cure that the world needed. Some criticized science itself, that people had placed so much faith in science, that science itself had become simply like religion, another superstition, except in another guise. Well, I don't think that those contemporaries or historians later who criticized both science and the fundamentalist religious groups exaggerated it. I think there was enough arrogance to go around. And this trial, I think, displayed that with great theater and great drama. What will, after all is said and done, though, as we will see in a moment, while the trial will end, this discussion between science and religion will not. That it goes on today. In fact, this very question of the battle now between teachings of evolution and creation continue right down to this day. And in fact, has been a revival of the doctrine of creationism. So that is right back in the news again today. But this is where it comes from. It is also rooted, think about the 1920s for a moment. As I was rereading some of the material on the Scopes trial, and I asked myself the last time when I was here, how would I feel if I lived in the 1920s? If I witnessed these incredible, enlightening changes taking place in the world. And the one thing that science does, and perhaps it is not intentioned, but it does it anyway. Science very brutally and savagely strips away myths, does it not? That is its intentions, is to strip away myths and mysteries. But when it strips away myths and mysteries of our lives and the universe, generally science does not provide a substitute. Nor does it even provide, when it strips away, particularly when it comes to religion, it may strip away religious beliefs as superstitious and old folk sayings, but it does not provide a system of adequate ethics to take its place. Nor the science, no matter how hard the science is and progressive, can science do everything. It cannot provide sustenance or support for people in times of grief and struggle. And no matter how good science is, no matter how far science has gone to this day, science still has only touched a small part of the mysteries of man and his universe. So maybe perhaps there is, and there was then, and I think there was then this concern from fundamentalists that this arrogance of science was unwarranted because it didn't do everything. But yet, they supported evolution as if, now, the interesting thing is that while they could criticize the church for not being able to produce a soul in a test tube, science has been known to be wrong too as well. At that time, science could not reproduce Cro-Magnon man or Australopithecus either. Much of that then was simply what? Theory. So, and particularly those theories that involved psychology. Sometimes you wonder, well, who was the craziest? The psychologists or the people that they were treating with some of their theories. Particularly Freud's theories on the ego, the superego, and the Oedipus complex. So, I mean, there was room to go around for criticism. Well, the fundamentalists did not like change. It did not trust. They had a fundamental distrust for human capacity to solve their problems or to provide answers for everything. That only divine intervention could do that. So it was these ideas that were at the heart of the Scopes trial. These assumptions, these criticisms, these different points of view were not only at the heart of the Scopes trial, but was at the heart of this paradox of the 1920s in which you had people reacting against progress. As the trial started, the state's case was simple at first. Tennessee simply wanted to demonstrate that its law was not capricious, that the law simply was grounded, well grounded in law, not the fact that it was true, but it was a law that had been legally passed by the state of Tennessee. On the other hand, the defense for John T. Scopes began with a simple strategy. On the one hand, you have the state now simply trying to prove that the law was neither wicked nor foolish, or as I use the word, capricious. John T. Scopes' defense was as simple when it first began. It was simply to show that the teaching and the doctrines of evolution were consistent with Christian faith, and that Genesis was allegorical. That you could believe in the Christian faith and still believe in evolution, because the chapter on the creation of man itself was allegorical, even though the principles perhaps may have been well grounded. And for a while, it didn't work for Darrell and Hayes. It clearly seemed as if the state of Tennessee would have an easy time proving that its law was not wicked. It wasn't intended to hurt anybody, nor that it was capricious. You may disagree with, but it was a law duly enacted by the state legislature. In fact, the defense for Scopes began to worry about where they were going to go next, until Hayes decided to change the strategy. He decided to put the Bible, in a sense, on trial. So Hayes decided that, look, let's call William Jennings Bryan to the stand. As an expert witness on the Bible. Well, their strategy was clear. They wanted to get Bryan to admit that indeed Genesis was allegorical, thereby proving that it could be consistent with Christianity and evolution. He suggested that Darrell conduct the cross-examination. And I should point out that Darrell was at his best. Darrell savagely cross-examined William Jennings Bryan. He asked him questions about the Bible, forcing him to make literal responses about events in the chapter of Genesis. Do you, Mr. Bryan, believe that a whale had swallowed Jonah? And Bryan said, yes, I do. He said, well, it may not have been a whale, but it was some kind of a fish. But I do believe that he was swallowed by something. Do you, Mr. Bryan, believe then also that Eve was made from the rib of Adam? Yes, I do, literally. That women were made from the rib of Adam. He didn't waver. Do you also believe then, Mr. Bryan, that Joshua actually made the sun stand still? And Bryan responded in the affirmative. Yes, I do. And then he asked the most important question of Bryan, who began to sweat. It was hot. People were fanning themselves. You could see, when you read transcripts, I read a couple of them, and you could tell that it was tense. That there was a level almost of hysteria in the courtroom between the two forces. And they did not like each other. Bryan was intense. Darrell was merciless in his cross-examination. Then he went on to ask Bryan the most important question. Do you, Mr. Bryan, believe that the world was created in 6 days? Bryan responded, yes, I do, but let me expand upon that for a second. When it says 6 days, it did not necessarily mean that a day was 24 hours. I mean, the Bible could have meant that the day was not 24 hours. A day could have been 1,000,000 years. Oh, hell. What had he done? He had just fallen into the trap that they hoped that Bryan would fall into. Already by this time, in answering these questions, literally in the way that Darrell phrased them, he mocked Bryan. He mocked him so that people in the courthouse began to snicker and laugh. Even Bryan's own followers by the end of the trial began to laugh and snicker at this champion. Yes.
Even though Bryan was the lawyer for the state, he still was able to
yes.
Forced him to testify?
He didn't have, no. He was not forced to testify. He was happy to testify. After all, was he not there to do what? He was there to do battle. And my God, what better place to do battle than to sit there and answer these charges himself? I mean, a man, the silver-tongued orator, you would think that this would have been, now, this was a risky strategy. I mean, given the fact that his reputation for a speaker. But what Darrell and Hayes counted on was that you could not defend a literal interpretation of the Bible without ultimately looking like a fool, particularly if you could phrase it a certain way. And if they could get this man to admit that you could not always take the Bible literally in Genesis, then when he makes the comment that a day may not have been 24 hours, but it could have been 1,000,000 years, what he is saying then, that even if it's that one statement, that the Bible and that this chapter could have been, at least in this instance, allegorical. Is that not what the defense wanted? You could see that Bryan was terribly upset with his performance. The question of John Scopes' guilt was really already decided before the trial had really begun. In terms of his innocence or guilt, he was guilty and he was found guilty. He was fined, and eventually the case was thrown out over a technicality. And immediately after that, the case was thrown out on a technicality. The whole evolution movement, after Bryan was so beaten so badly in court, rapidly died and waned. But for Bryan, though the trial had an impact on him that was unforeseen, he was already old and frail. Bryan felt that he had been made to look as if he were a stupid, ignorant man. Bryan spent his last days, he died shortly after the trial. That is why I said it was ironic and prophetic when he made the comment that he had come to engage in a duel to the death. It would be his death. His last days were filled with Bryan writing an autobiographical statement, trying to prove to people that he was neither ignorant nor an uneducated man. But he died shortly after. It had taken its toll. The anti-evolution movement became discredited. In New Hampshire, any bills regarding evolution was now referred to the Department of Wildlife. That is the way that the movement ended for a moment. But as I pointed out, it was not the end of it. Today, the battle goes on. There are those who believe in creationism, and there are those who believe in evolution. Of course, the only problem is that there is still this kind of inflexibility. That one argues that only one can be taught and not the other. Of course, at the heart of education is to entertain different points of view and different ideas. So obviously, a teacher or an educator would not object to both theories being taught and allowing the individual to make their own decision. Because ultimately, no matter what anyone tells you, the university is not infallible. That may come as a shock to you. And it may come as an even greater shock that even some professors may not be infallible. Of course, that doesn't include me. But I'm right up there at the top of the list. But it is true. I mean, this debate still rages. Well, By 1928, we don't hear much discussion about evolution. In 1928, America is now trying to decide on who it will elect as its next president. The 1920s has been a decade of great change, and on one hand, it's been a decade of, on the surface, seemingly prosperity. So who would now lead the country in 1928? For the Democrats, they decided to nominate the first real urbanite for president, Al Smith, from New York City. Well, from New York. Al Smith had an outstanding record as a Democratic governor, elected 4 times in the state of New York. He was clearly an outstanding candidate for president. He was extremely intelligent. He had a successful record. He seemed a logical nomination for the Democratic Party. In fact, he was only the second major Democrat to evolve from the Democratic Party in the 20th century, besides Woodrow Wilson. Well, his nomination was a pretty easy thing, except there were certain varieties of Southerners who opposed his nomination in Houston, Texas in 1928. Yes, we hosted the Democratic Convention. There were reasons that will become really apparent in a moment that many of these Southerners did not support or did not get enthusiastically at first behind Al Smith. But after the convention, and despite the misgivings of certain Southern Democrats, they did nominate Al Smith. And now you have a Democratic Party that wants to win the presidency really bad. In fact, they will adopt a strategy that they will try to outdo the Republicans. They will, in a sense, their issues will sound, particularly in terms of fiscal policy, they will sound as much like Republicans as Republicans. After all, it's hard to criticize Republicans at this point because in 1928, here Republicans are riding what seems to be an incredible success story in terms of the economic success of America in the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge has decided that he is not going to run again in 1928 for the Republican Party, but the party itself has done well. So how do you beat a party, an incumbent party that can look at the economy? And in 1928, at least in the beginning to 28, the economy looks as great as it could possibly be. So you try to be as much like that party in a sense as you possibly can without becoming that party. And so they will follow. That is their strategy, which will backfire on them, as we will see in a moment. But in the end, though, Smith's campaign and the failures of his success to become president in 1928 can be summed up in a comment by one delegate at the Houston Convention in 1928 when he said, "I am for Rome, Romanism, and rebellion." Well, what this meant is that Romanism, Smith was a Catholic, an Irish Catholic boy. He had grown up as an Irish Catholic boy in the East. This election, in fact, would be a barometer, would be a gauge of how far America had come socially in terms of the acceptance of Catholicism. It would be, in a sense, a vote on how far an Irish Catholic boy could go and how soon he could get there. It would be, in many ways, a test of would America be willing to accept a true urbanite as president. There's always been this kind of mythology about urbanites and versus people who came from with rural values. Farmers. Even though it amazes me that while they love to attribute these wonderful virtues of the farmers, in no period that we've discussed so far has anybody decided to help the farmers. And that was certainly true of Coolidge, who was a 5-generation product of the farmers, did nothing for the farmers. But to simply say that, well, that was always the farmer's lot. And why should anybody expect anything different? We didn't. Businesses were who Coolidge allied himself with. But Cal, as he was called by his friends, Cal decided he would not run, and instead the Republicans turned to a man by the name of Herbert Hoover, who had gained a reputation during World War I. But his most important attribute, I think, was that there were a number of things about Hoover that were perfect for the Republicans in 1928 against one like Smith. He was Iowa born in Iowa. He would play on that Iowa theme. He would talk about himself not as an engineer, which he was. He would not talk about himself as an efficient corporate manager type. But he would campaign on the image that he was a man from a small Iowa town who used to love to fish. Where he learned to trap rabbits using a crate. How he had been taught to shoot pigeons and other wildlife by a Native American. How he used to love to belly flop down the hills during the winter. He was a product of all those rural values that made America strong. He once made a statement, I don't know, this statement here, I think if you, on hindsight, if one listens to this statement, you have to wonder about Hoover. He said, quote, when he was talking about how he had learned to kill prairie chickens and pigeons and stuff with a bow and arrow by his Native American, he said that, quote, fishing was good for the soul of man. For all men were equal before the fishes. Now, I must confess, that did not strike me as an especially erudite statement of a presidential candidate. I suppose, though, we're all equal before the fishes. But no one seemed to mind. Well, Coolidge decided to accept the nomination. And in many ways, Coolidge was the epitome of capitalism, even though Coolidge was the epitome of capitalism, even though he tried to promote this image that he was just a rural farm boy. He didn't come from a family of great reputation. Hoover. Oh, forget about Coolidge. Have I said Coolidge? Yes. I don't remember saying Coolidge. Oh, well, we're talking about Hoover. Herbert Hoover. Who else but Hoover? Was the slogan. Well, no, Hoover was the engineer, was the man from Iowa who tried to project himself as a man from a humble background with no lineage, but he had those tough American values. He was the one that went fishing. They gave the fish statement. But only Hoover could have given a statement like that. Okay, about the fishes being equal before the fishes. Calvin Coolidge didn't have that kind of humor. In fact, Calvin Coolidge had no humor at all. So it was Hoover that projected this image. Now, Smith's campaign was run by an interesting person. But a moment ago, I told you that they were trying to outdo the Republicans, or seem like the Republicans, to steal some of their thunder. In fact, to do this, they hired, as his campaign manager, a man by the name of John Raskob. John Raskob, in fact, was a Republican and was as capitalist as one could get. In fact, John Raskob listed in Who's Who in America, when they asked him what his occupation was, when he was listed in Who's Who in America, John Raskob said he was a capitalist. So what better way to fight the Republicans than to hire a capitalist, a Republican, to run your campaign for you? So the Democrats and Al Smith, again, tried to outdo Republicans by hiring a Republican. Sounds kind of familiar if you think about a president election that's going on today. Really kind of close. But because they seemed on issues so similar, then there would be other things that the campaign would ultimately be decided on. It would be decided on personality, if issues are not a real important thing. It would be decided on religion. And it would be decided on prohibition. Now, this is an interesting sort of, if you think about, I don't want to get into today's presidential election, but think about some of the parallels here. In the absence of real contrasting issues, in which there are deep philosophical differences, at least as they are advocated by the candidates, there are those who have argued it will ultimately turn on things like personality or character, or even the issue of religion. Generally minor issues that would not find their way as centerpieces for elections. But they come to dominate in 1928. Particularly the question of religion and prohibition or rum. The moment that Al Smith won the nomination, the Republicans, particularly the fundamentalists within the Republican Party, began a whispering campaign against Smith. They were concerned that Smith's election would give control of the White House to a foreign pope. That the White House would actually function from the Vatican instead of Washington, D.C. As one Methodist minister put it, no governor can kiss the papal ring and get within gunshot of the White House. This Methodist minister was generally considered fairly radical. But his comment that no governor who was a Catholic and symbolically kissing the papal ring could get within gunshot of the White House was not the only minister or Protestant or conservative. The liberal Christian Century, a liberal Christian publication, had this to say about Al Smith. They cautioned voters to look with concern upon the seating of a representative of an alien culture, of a medieval Latin mentality, of an undemocratic hierarchy, and of a foreign potentate in the great office of the president. Well, that was the liberal press. Then you had slander against the Catholic Church at this time. Certain pamphlets were passed out. One was entitled Traffic in Nuns. That somehow these nuns were engaged in activities that were unbecoming of nuns. That the Catholic nuns were, what was the old, we had a sort of, when I grew up I heard it saying that the nuns were none too pure. And that's what the pamphlets were insinuating. Or they had a pamphlet entitled Alcohol Smith. Now, it is true that John Raskob was a wet campaign manager. In other words, he believed in liquor and alcohol. Smith was not opposed to it either. This question then of prohibition becomes a central question. Obviously, they had just passed the amendment creating prohibition, and during the 1920s with this fundamentalist backlash, obviously reaction, the question of whether a person was dry or wet was an important issue, particularly among a certain real fanatic wing of the Prohibition party. They particularly criticized his campaign manager. John Raskob made it known and it was unapologetic about his wet views in America, that is, supporting the consumption and production of alcohol. On the other hand, and Smith did very little to discourage that notion that he was opposed to a wet America, that he was in favor of a dry America. On the other hand, Hoover seized the opportunity to embrace prohibition. He said that prohibition was in fact, it was a noble, it was a great social and economic experiment. That prohibition was a great economic and social experiment. More and more, Smith was lambasted by the Prohibition forces, who were well organized and well financed. The center of this political leadership supporting Prohibition again was centered in the Methodist Church at this time, under the fanatical leadership of Bishop Cannon. Cannon said the question was very simple. The question before the American people about who to elect in 1928 was very simple. The question was, shall America elect a cocktail president? Shall America elect a cocktail president? Well, Hoover won the election. While the popular vote was not, the margin was not that wide in the popular vote, Hoover will beat him electorally with a margin. Well, he will beat him. He will win 444 electoral votes, Hoover, to only 87 for Smith. But clearly, though, the defeat for Smith had everything to do with, one, he was a Catholic. At a time when Americans were also in the midst of an anti-immigrant mood. Remember, we talked about that. That in 1924, what was the most important piece of legislation dealing with immigration? The National Origins Act. There was this anti-immigration sentiment of foreigners. For instance, critics of Al Smith. Now, Al Smith is from New York City. New York City has probably, at this time, the highest what? Concentration of immigrants in the country. In fact, it was charged by those who were anti-immigration, anti-foreign, that the only way that he got the election in the first place was that they gave the suffrage to these aliens who were coming off the boat every day. As Bob Jones put it, of Bob Jones University. As Bob Jones put it to a Birmingham congregation, he was a Reverend Bob Jones. I'll tell you, brother, that the big issue we've got to face ain't the liquor question. I'd rather see a saloon on every corner in the South than to see the foreigners elect Al Smith. And it didn't hurt that this notion of foreigners, this notion of Catholicism, this notion of prohibition. In short, in 1928, no matter how good Al Smith may have been as a presidential candidate, in these years of reaction, in many quarters of a very rabidly nationalistic America that insisted that the country be represented by old values, not new values of the East, not new values of an urbanite, not new values that may somehow be shaped by foreigners, not new values, in fact, from a foreign religion, but the old Protestant Anglo-Saxon values. That's what America needed. And in many ways, that's what it characterizes this paradox we've been talking about. Even in 1928, we see this permeating the election. As William Allen White put it to sum this whole thing up, it is not that Governor Smith is a Catholic and a wet, which makes him an offense to the villages and town dwellers. The whole Puritan civilization, which has built a sturdy, orderly nation, is threatened by Smith. In other words, it was not Smith so much himself as it was the fact that he represented something. He represented a threat to the very values that Puritan society had created several hundred years earlier. In other words, as one scholar put it, Smith has simply arrived too early. Because he was not, as I pointed out in the beginning, he certainly was a strong candidate which had a lot of virtues, but he simply, at this time, he had simply arrived too early. Well, now we go to another issue. I'm sorry, I didn't even, as I was talking about Al Smith and Herbert Hoover, I probably assumed that you knew how to spell their names anyway, but maybe I shouldn't make those kind of assumptions. But there they are, Al Smith and Herbert Hoover, and they are also now history. Now we get into a very ticklish subject. In other words, now I am going to burst your bubble. In some ways, that is exactly what happened in 1929. The bursting of a bubble. Or we could call it the Great Smash-Up of 1929. Let's talk about the Great Depression and why it occurred. If I haven't said anything, I've said this over a dozen times, that the 1920s on the surface seemed like a decade of unparalleled prosperity. This prosperity, from about 1923 on, was absolutely contagious. That was this feeling that America was in an unprecedented era. An era where, in fact, everyone could become rich and financially well off. In fact, one of the most ironic statements will be Herbert Hoover's comment right before that he was elected in 1928, that America had arrived at the point where poverty, it was so wealthy and so successful and so prosperous that they had arrived at the point where they could now vanquish poverty from the face of the earth. He made that statement in 1928 as he ran for election. Well, this decade was a wild decade. It was as wild as the Charleston and the Lindy Hop in terms of economics. It was a decade in which America experienced one speculative orgy after another. You had the Florida real estate speculation, which collapsed, by the way, in 1929. But still, this notion, stock speculation, we'll talk about in a moment, beside real estate speculation. Stock becomes, in many ways, symbolic of what happens in the 1920s. Both the promise and perhaps the reality. Before World War I, The only people that invested in stock were people who were wealthy. But during the 1920s, you have an additional number of people who will become investors in the stock market. It is clear, however, that the number of people who invest in the stock market has been exaggerated. Okay? Because the impression one gets when you read the literature, if you read newspapers of the 1920s, the feeling that you get is that everyone is in the stock market. One scholar probably estimates that the stock market probably gained about 1 million new investors. Well, but the point was, whether this was true or not, it was this sense of what? It was this sense that everyone could play the stock market. You do have certain things in the 1920s that you did not have before. For instance, you do have new players, and probably players who really should not have gotten in the stock market to begin with. Those who have to borrow money to buy stocks. A phenomenon called buying on margin. You borrow money to buy, to pay down on a stock, and you hope that the stock continues to do well, so then you can pay off that and then borrow more money to buy more stock. If people did this, if people borrowed money to buy stock, if they bought stock on margin, it was rooted in this eternal optimism that seemed to permeate the 1920s. What would have been a risk or a sense of a risk at any other time didn't seem like a risk to Americans in the 1920s. Zelda, the wife of Scott Fitzgerald, made this comment about America in the 1920s years later. She said, "We grew up founding our dreams on the infinite promises of American advertising." Talked about advertising. "I still believe," she said years later, "that one can play the piano by mail, that one can learn to play the piano by mail, and that mud will give you a perfect complexion." She was probably right. I use it all the time. And then here again we go back to John Raskob. John Raskob, in Ladies Magazine, Ladies Journal, Home Journal, made the comment that if a person saved $15 a month and bought sound common stock, it would be worth $80,000 in 20 years. Guaranteed. And $80,000 at this time was a what? Was a lot of money, which was financial security. If you invested in sound common stock, $15 a month, you would be able to realize $80,000 in 20 years. And as John was doing, he guaranteed it. Well, look at the New York Stock Exchange to see just what Americans thought. And let me make a comment about the stock market. And this is probably unscientific, and I'll probably get the economists on me. I'll probably be getting email from all the economists. But to a great extent, the stock market may not always tell you how sound or how fundamentally structurally sound the economy is. The stock market tells you what people think about the economy and about America. The stock market often functions more as a psychological barometer of what people think about the economy than what really actually than what it really actually tells you about the economy itself. That is why certain people have manipulated in past years the stock market. Prominent economists make a prediction that something's going to happen, and what happens? If they predict that the stock market is going to drop, and what do people do? They sell, and they put into motion the drop. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We'll see in a moment what happens here. But in 1923, we can begin to see people believing that the stock market is the best investment a person can make. Between 1923 and 1928, the New York Stock Exchange reports that it increases from 230 million shares to 1,125 million shares between 1923 and 1928. That's a huge leap. Let me repeat that again. At the New York Stock Exchange, in 1923, there were 230 million shares. By 1928, the number of shares would leap to 1,125 million shares. An extraordinary leap in the number of shares on the stock market. By 1928, it seemed, I always use the word seemed because the notion here is that appearances are more, things are more apparent and real. But by 1928, it seemed that no matter what you invested in, it turned to gold. That everything was successful at the beginning of 1928. Stock industrials, the heavy industrials at this time, went up an astonishing 86.5 points. At this time, that's a huge increase. Consumers would crowd outside the office in the morning before it even opened of stockbrokers, waiting so they could open up shop so they could buy stock. They would stand in their offices staring at the blackboards that had the stock numbers, or they would spend all day looking at the tickers, those ticker tapes. They rattle off the numbers. And what they saw, they liked. As one person put it, one economist put it, they borrowed money, bought more stock, and still bought and borrowed still more money, and still bought more stock. And this went on. By 1928, it was said that the stock market was carrying the entire economy in America. That the stock market was said to be carrying the whole economy, the entire economy in America. I think this discussion of this aspect of what is happening in America is very relevant, because we're in a similar kind of stock market boom. I'm not making any predictions here, but we'll just go through. I think it's something to keep in mind if you happen to see any similarities. But the stock market it was carrying the entire economy by 1928. Actually, historians argue that if it had not been for the stock market, that the prosperity of the 1920s would have come to an end much sooner. That we would have had a depression, not in 1929, but even earlier. Why? Because by 1927, you could see two things. One, by 1927, you could see that consumers had cut spending for heavy, durable goods. That's always a sign of what? That if consumers are not buying, then they're having money problems. The second one we'll look at the next time we meet, and then we'll look at the reasons for the crash of 1929 and what happens to America in the wake of it.